My name is Ryan Fasan, technical consultant for Tile of Spain, and thank you all for joining us for this post-coverings wrap-up and recap of our press conference that we did on the show floor with the press tour, talking about trends for 2022. As I mentioned, you got me a little bit casual and with a very scratchy voice. I've been confined to my bedroom for the 4 days after coming home from the show, and I'm still not feeling great. But I'm so happy to be here with you and sharing this with everybody that didn't get a chance to make it to the show. I'm going to just kill the video here so we can just pay attention to the slides and everything that I'm talking about, because I think that there's a lot of really interesting things going on in terms of trends in general for this year. It's probably honestly the most difficult year it's ever been to be a trends forecaster. Because when you're looking at trends, you're kind of trying to get the overall general pulse of what everyone's thinking and feeling, and what is going to build the sort of overall tone of whatever field you're in. In this case, we happen to be talking about ceramics, but anyone that's been in any of my presentations knows that I tend to take an overarching view. And I think that, you know, it's kind of it's not weird to say that it's one of the weirdest times that any of us have ever experienced in our lifetime and are probably ever going to. So trying to create or think of where everyone's going to be looking for trends is incredibly difficult right now. But I think I've got, a couple of really neat ideas to take you through. So first, we're going to look at how our perspective has changed over our collective experiences in the past 2.5 or so years, and what that's done to our concept of trends. And then we're going to look at how these shifts in consciousness affect how we think about, label, and conceptualize the design of our spaces, and how tile can harness this narrative. Then we're going to look specifically at the tile industry in general and some of the novelties that have been coming out, because this has actually been one of the most innovative sort of times in a very innovative sector. So it's exciting to be in tile because of this narrative that's building. And then finally, we're going to look at some sort of supporting things that sort of reinforce everything that we've talked about throughout the session today. So first, we're going to take a little bit of a look back just over the past 12 months, but obviously we can't talk about the past 12 months without talking about the past, say, 24 to 36. And the fact is, 2021 was, if there's one thing that can sort of epitomize the past year, is that we've all been kind of adapting and acting on what we've learned over these past experiences. Some of them have been really hard lessons. Some of them have been very valuable and great lessons. And it's up to us to kind of decide whether we want to just kind of go back to the way things were or use this as a catalyst for change. And all the while, we've been experiencing so many firsts this year in weather, in political events, in literal and cultural events. There's been so much change that I think you can appreciate why it's so hard for someone to forecast what we're all looking for, because I think everyone has a different context that's come out of their experiences in the past little while. Although there are some really strong lines that are connecting the dots for just about everyone right now, and one of them is that we're really kind of craving connection. We're figuring out how we're going to reemerge. I know a lot of us that were at coverings last week had a very similar story to me. I mean, the last time I got on a plane and spoke to a crowd at a convention was February February 8th, 2020. And then the last week was the next time that I spoke. So, that interim has, there's been a lot of experiences and a lot of change and a lot of solitude for a lot of us. And we're figuring out, how we're going to adapt and find that balance between our digital life and our real life, and find meaningful connections that are healthy and good for us. That has an impact on the spaces that we're creating, because we're creating spaces for our lifestyle, which has never been more different. We started to realize over the past couple of years that our life is so much more hybridized. It doesn't fit into simple boxes like we used to think it did. I think we were always kind of a lot more hybridized than we identified with. Most people identified with their career or their vocation or the fact that they're a parent, and one of those things sort of owned their identity and their lifestyle. And the past couple of years has kind of proved to all of us that we change gears so many times throughout every single day of our life, and we need our spaces to adapt with us. So hybridization is kind of the key theme, I think, for the coming year. And we're starting to see those shifts in design language, in how we're conceptualizing our spaces, because a home can't just be a home. It also needs to be a school. It needs to be an office. It needs to be a commercial kitchen. It needs to be so many things. And the same is true for all of our commercial spaces. Our cafes have to be office spaces. Our office spaces need to be meeting rooms. They need to be almost like community centers. So we're relooking at how we're designing and conceptualizing and even identifying our spaces and our lifestyles. Some of the things that are really key for us is we know that the social connection is something that is integral to humanity, having been isolated for some time. So now we're starting to ask the questions: what's really good for us? How do we balance our real life with our digitized life to come up with a hybrid that's optimal and for both and for our health? We know that it's important for us to gather, but we know that we need to find ways to do it responsibly and in a healthy way, to be able to avoid disasters like we've experienced in the past couple of years. So all of this is about a reshuffle of our priorities during this period of reflection, and figuring out how we want to reset and what kind of operating system we want to reset to. Now, all of that builds into the ceramic tile story, because ceramics wind up, and I'm going to build this story over this session, wind up being the cohesive answer to address almost all of these universal shifts in our priorities and our lifestyle. We've realized that little things add up to a huge impact, and that bandwidth, what anything asks of us, whether it's a relationship or the space, our office or our profession, it's our most precious commodity. And the less bandwidth that something asks of us, the more valuable it is to us. And I'm going to tell that story about ceramic as we go through. On a macro scale, we're realizing that national and even global disasters are going to continue to happen. And we need to be able to not just design for what's okay for now. We need to sort of plan for worst case scenario and kind of adopt a bit more of a good enough is not good enough sort of scenario, because climate change, fossil fuel reserves, waste mitigation, all of these are really high on our radars, and they should be right now. So stewardship and strategies like around environmental stewardship become incredibly more important. So I think you're starting to see the dots that I'm laying, and this is sort of telling the story as to why ceramics have such a powerful role in where we're going in the future, because this is one thing that I started seeing in design on every layer, from city planning down all the way through every layer of design to a simple standalone residence or multifamily residence. Things like the shifting of the phrase "I'm going to work," wherein work used to be a noun, it used to be a place that we went to. Now it's just a verb. We can work, we've realized this over the past couple of years, we can work absolutely anywhere. So we're needing to design our homes, our offices, our restaurants, everything within our space to be adaptable to be a workspace, which is in turn changing the way we conceptualize our workspace. It's even changing the way we think about our city centers, because we're starting to realize that um, that sort of productivity for productivity's sake is not a healthy goal for us. So work is changing, and that's changing the way that we think about our spaces. It's changing the language we use to define our spaces. Um, and all of everything's kind of shifting to favor agility and inclusivity. One of the things that's the most important is cohesion, this flow of space, so that there isn't a feel of barriers. That's something that's come into our language socially. It's something that's come into our thought processes as a community, and it's something that's coming into our architecture. And so a material like ceramic tile that is a chameleon that can flow seamlessly into the vernacular of multiple different materials in a believable way that has one cohesive maintenance profile is one of the things that answers the question for how do we create these adaptive spaces. It gives both visual and technical continuity, no matter how we need to design our space. It provides that ease of ownership that that proves to our owners that we're thinking about them, because aftercare is not an afterthought for the people that we're creating spaces for. Durability in something like ceramic tile that outlives not only us, but probably the building that we're putting it in, it's a force multiplier for sustainability. So this kind of concept is something that we're really grasping for today in terms of design. And I think that this industry is one of the ones that's situated to answer it perfectly on almost every level. What we're looking for is agility in our spaces today. Everything needs to be supportive to multiple use cases. And so we're asking, how do we create these spaces that can adapt and support to a wide range of varied use cases? The bar we're asking materials and our design to satisfy today is so much higher. And it's forcing our materials choices to adapt, because they're becoming systemic choices. They're not just eye candy anymore. They're an integral part of how the building performs. One thing that's really kind of shining a light on this is that we're really focusing, we've looked as a culture, we've looked at how we're using language and how language can be more inclusive, uh, more inclusive on every level across culture. And it's something that's coming into our it's coming into our design thought process as well. We're really thinking about how we're naming the spaces on our plans, right down to, like, this is the first sort of wireframe that any design professional will go through with their client in kind of the research and scope phase, is defining the rooms and spaces that we're going to use, whether it's a residence or a city or a borough or whatever we happen to be designing. The language that we're using matters. So we're trying to incorporate local vernacular into and inclusivity into our design, and the name of our space dictates that tonal outcome, and having a material that can flow through all of that. And it doesn't matter what look we want it to finish with, that we're designing for performance first and applying to whatever we need it to, is an incredibly powerful tool. What we're looking for in materials today is something that's contingency agnostic. This is something that's been in my presentations for, basically since this all started, that designing for a minimum is no longer a viable option, because the minimums are always going to change. So if we're always just satisfying code, it's only good enough for the second it was built. And then something's going to come along and it's going to change the bar. The only thing that truly, to my mind, is contingency agnostic is something that is going to outlive the space itself. And that's something like ceramic tile. So enough about the context. Let's look at the tile industry as a whole and how it's kind of incorporating these thought processes and embodying them in the products that we're creating for 2022. In color, there's all kinds of color theorists that are way better than I am. Although it's something that, you know, I love doing, and I look into a lot of their work, and I started to see some really interesting parallels across things like all of the paint companies. They spend millions of dollars and have a lot of people every year going into their paint forecasts, things like the Pantone Color Institute as well. And when you started to look at them, there was this really cohesive, almost all of them came to the same kind of mix of tones that were for this year. And it was neutrals, mostly tinted neutrals. Anyone that's a painter, it will be familiar with the term filters, and we'll get to that in a sec. So it'll be tinted neutrals that have a hint of greens or blues or reds, but it'll be, you know, grays and beiges. That was about 70% of their range. About 30% of their range was also, you know, not vibrant, but heavily saturated, deep, rich tones that were offsetting counterpoints to these really soft and warm neutrals. And I think that this is because we're really utilizing colors very differently in our interiors today. There's kind of some cohesiveness to, no matter what your design language is, whether it's Scandinavian, you know, French colonial, maximal, you know, any of the major kind of design styles that you might be buying into, the use of color is kind of unified across all of them, and it's creating this 21st century vernacular that kind of transcends all the different design styles. And one of them, and probably the most eye-catching because it really is kind of the punctuation, is using color as a foil, using it as the exclamation point in a broad expanse of, I'm going to use the term white space, but it doesn't necessarily have to be white. It just needs to be neutral and soft. So you have this broad expanse of soft neutrality, and then you have a punch of color that draws your eye to a certain space that provides the exclamation point in an interior. We're also playing with saturation in very, very literal ways. We either tend to have a very desaturated tone throughout, or a very heavily saturated tone throughout. We generally don't do both within the same space. Colors used, and here's where the term filter comes in. So when you're painting, oftentimes if I'm painting something in a green, and I want to have a contrasting tone like a red that comes in somewhere, I will do a filter in the shadowy areas using a deep red over the green. That makes it darker, that adds the shadow, but it still adds that tone of red within the green that allows me to play off of it somewhere else. Interior designers are doing that in ways now because our materials are doing that, because we can add layers and depths within our materials so that we can actually have a filtered neutral, and we're seeing that in a big way coming out. We're playing with temperature differently this year, in that we're kind of staying within a band of the color wheel. If we're in generally warm tones, we tend to stay in generally warm tones unless we need that punch, that exclamation point, and using color as a foil in contrast. So we either stay warm or cool. We generally don't work with both within the same space unless there's a very strong reason for it. And then finally, and this is where tile really shines, is, and yes, I know that was punny, is by playing with finish. We can really subtly change the way our color reads, because the more matte the glaze is that we add, and this is why ceramics can do it, is because we work in glazes, and because the glass component of a glaze can either sinter, matte, or glossy, or anywhere in between. And the more glossy it is, the more subjective it is to light variance perspective within a space that the color reads. The more matte it is, the more it will always read as the color that it is. It doesn't matter what kind of light quality there is. So we can play with that when we want a space to be adaptive to our client. We tend to use more glossy surfaces. When we want it for a branding purpose or something like that, where we need it to always read that exact shade, we tend to use a more matte surface. And that's something that we're paying incredible attention to in ceramics, to be able to minutely vary that finish that we're adding to our colors this year. So colors, again, are calling upon neutral materials as their inspiration. We're seeing a lot more value for raw, natural materials. As I said, over the past year, it's a trend that's been growing for the past few years now. We're seeing a lot less saturation now, and less stark whites, but more colored neutrals. We're seeing a lot more oatmeals, soft, warm whites, rather than stark and utilitarian, or, you know, almost sterilized whites. There's less focus on kind of mid-spectrum gray minimalism to a broad, multi-layered, warm, inviting, neutral palette, contrasted either with cooler or brighter, warmer, uplifting tones. Earth tones continue to rise with a lot of warmth. And so warm is kind of the overall tone for our color palette this year. We are seeing a lot of greens and blues, but the sort of base 80% field that we're seeing is this rich, inviting warmth. And a lot of the accents as well are sort of doubling down on that warmth. So we're seeing red wines, deep, rich earth tones, terracottas, rich berries. All of them are coming into our color palette to complement this overall really soft, warm neutral. So we talked a little bit as we were in color about the form and finish, and something that our industry has done impeccably well is double down on what we can do digitally to not only enhance, but actually create new depth in materials like stones and concretes and woods that we're interpreting in the medium of ceramic tile. I tend to use that rather than knocking off or something like that, because if we're interpreting that material in a ceramic medium, it has a completely different connotation than something that's a knockoff, because that's truly what we're doing today. Between being able to digitally overlay different qualities of fritz so that we can have multiple finishes within one piece, or actually create the sinking grain, just the subtle variation of a wood grain or a marble vein, through the use of sinking inks and other advanced digital techniques, either in the pressing or in the glazing step of the process. Truly, anything that is created in a ceramic medium is so realistic today that it transcends just visual. In fact, it's really hard to find visual images that actually capture just how deep this realism goes. You really need to touch them, and that's one of the things that's made it really difficult to do these presentations over the past couple of years, because in still photography, you have to have a very talented photographer with very expensive and well lit gear to be able to capture the amount of realism that goes into our materials today. So when it comes to actual sort of design motifs, one of them that I'm seeing more and more is this kind of reimagining of a chipped or variegated surface that started with terrazzo And we, in fact, we still see, as you saw, a whole bunch of terrazzos that are coming out this year in very, very effective ways. We're also seeing sort of agglomerate stone looks, things like Chepo de Gray or other, marbles and other metamorphic rocks that actually have different chunks of mineral material. We're seeing them being done in ceramic today because this kind of variegated tone, we see it in fashion and things like Donegal wool and tweed. They give an overall impression of a single color tone, and yet they have so much going on within them. This is kind of like a pixelated version of a filter. Instead of something being a gradation and wash that goes over the whole color that gives you little nuances of tone to pull out, it's a pixelated version of it. And we see this in these chipped sort of agglomerate styles as something that gives designers and owners a lot to play off with all of the other aspects of their interior or exterior design. Rounded curves are something that's been huge in Art Deco and Art Nouveau and mid-century modern, and right up to Apple and Steve Jobs and his sort of huge love affair with the rounded rectangle. This is something that's been so integral to design because of how it respects our humanity, and the sharp edge of a 90-degree angle is jarring to our soft human forms. And so we're seeing a lot of this come in, and I don't think that's surprising at all, given how much a lot of us have had to endure, suffer, and go through over the past few years, that this rounded form and its respect for our humanity is coming back to the fore. Now, here's another one that is kind of a blast from the past, is that, again, it's a softer rounded form. Oftentimes they have chiseled edges or softly broken edges, because it's a design style that came out of the French palace at Versailles. In fact, it's called the Versailles pattern, and it's there's all sorts of modern reinterpretations of it, but what it comes down to is a modularity of shapes, multiple different shapes with softly, naturally varied materials. And as you saw going through those slides, I'm going to just rewind and go through them again. This is a classic Versailles pattern here around the pool. We're seeing these modular forms and multiple formats come into things like classic subways, as well as stacked masonry stone. All of these are ceramic and porcelain, and bringing sort of new life to a very classic style. Now, we've seen a lot of natural materials and a lot of softer, more, I hate to use the word rustic because that's not right for right now, but for lack of a better term, something that could be more rustic. And there is a lot of that raw naturalness, and I think that that's better than rustic. But in contrast to that, we've got a lot of really crisp architectural linear forms that are coming to, rather than color as contrast, using texture and crispness as contrast to give a softer form of punctuation. Rather than exclamation point, maybe it's a semicolon. And here's one that's near and dear to my heart, is the sort of rebirth and revival of the centuries of history of classic ceramic production, sort of pre-1900s ceramic, like classic glazes, minerals and oxides, mixed with different frits and classic firing techniques to create these deep, rich tones that are the true art of ceramics. And we're seeing this huge revival, and it's lovely to see classic knowledge in glazes being married with advanced digital technologies to bring new life and a new reinterpretation for the 21st century to a lot of this ancestral knowledge in this industry. and I love to see that coming back in a big way in both classic revivals and in modern reinterpretations where we're using geometrics and our different finishing techniques. And this one with the blues is really showcasing that power of using finish in glossy and matte to show how color reads differently on any different finish. So we're using geometry and simple glazes to really bring new life to a very classic material. So that takes us through kind of the macro trends of how ceramics are kind of interpreting and embodying a lot of the trends that we talked about at the beginning. Because one of the things that we always have to think about when we're designing consumer materials is that different concerns are going to shift to the fore for our clients. Experiences are telling us that we need to be more agile because we are for sure going to be thrown more curveballs. And all of that kind of builds to the story that ceramics are where people need to be looking for a lot of these answers. I hope I've sort of showcased some of the trends that really prove that the product developers among the manufacturers are really getting it and understanding what their clients are looking for, because they're giving all of the surface value. The material itself gives all of this undervalue that speaks to everything everyone's looking for right now, that it's a safe product that has high durability, that's infinitely livable for absolutely any space, no matter how agile it needs to be. And if it's thought about optimally, it has the ability to be the lowest cost option. And even in installation, you know, if your installers are thinking about it in a certain way, then and installing it at different stages than maybe it has been done in the past, it's possible to really mitigate the cost of installation as well. So there's all sorts of food for thought. I'm going to leave you with just one last thought that it's something that, you know, I know that there's a lot of surface products that are incorporating nanotechnology, that are using reactive coatings with different minerals that make them antibacterial. We've actually got some that are going for antiviral status as well. The one thing that makes ceramics a unique medium for this is that they're 100% inert. And because these coatings are encapsulated within the glaze of the tile, it's not a bioavailable material. So, you know, the minerals that are going into these nanoreactive coatings that make the surface of the tile reacting with different qualities of light, depending on which nano coating they're using, it is one of the safest materials to be doing that in because of its lack of bioavailability. So, you know, on every level, I think ceramics really do sort of address the shifting needs of how we're developing products for our need for agile and inclusive spaces. So I hope I've given you all some food for thought and some new information today. I hope my voice wasn't too scratchy for you. I have done my best, and I'm here if any of you have any questions. So thank you all for showing up today.